One of the most inspiring things I ever hear men say is, I'm stopping the violence in my time. It stops in my generation and I'm not passing it on.
Welcome to Voices Towards 2050, the official podcast series of the Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence Commission. Please be aware that this podcast discusses topics related to domestic, family and sexual violence, which may be distressing for some listeners. Support is available. If you need assistance, please contact 1-800-RESPECT or reach out to your local support services. Thank you for joining us.
I want to start today, as I always do, by acknowledging the lands that I'm on. And today I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my deepest respects to their elders, past and present, for their care for these lands and for their incredible ongoing generosity and wisdom. My commitment is to always work and live as an ally in this role and always. Today's guest is someone I admire deeply and who I've wanted to speak to on the podcast for quite a while. Jo, welcome to the podcast.
It's so lovely to be here, and what a nice thing for you to say.
Thank you. So, Jo, I'm going to embarrass you a bit and do a little, just a brief bio. And then we'll get started. So Jo Ball was appointed as Victoria's Commissioner for LGBTIQA+ communities in 2024 and has more than 25 years of experience across disability, housing, homelessness, community advocacy and social services. He has led landmark initiatives like the creation of the Rainbow Door, a service that provides mental health, family violence and other specialist services to the LGBTIQA+ communities. Jo, your leadership was recognised nationally in 2020 when you were named one of Australia's 50 outstanding LGBTI+ leaders. I'd like to get started, Jo, by getting you to talk to us a bit about what motivates you to do this work. We've talked about this work, both how rewarding but how challenging it is. So what is it that motivates you to do the work?
It is people. I mean, that sounds really straightforward, but it's like actually I have real clear visions of certain people, that pop up in my mind around certain pieces of work. And I don't know, I just really do it in their name. Like I have some people that have shared their story with me, like in this context around family violence. And I'll be up giving a speech or, sitting on a round table and I can see them in my mind's eye. And I feel like I carry those people around with me and they pop up at just the right moment. And they're the people that I do it for. I do it for them because they are not in the room, but I take them with me. And I really believe that when we make things better for people who are having the worst time or are the most marginalised, we make it better for everyone. But sometimes I think what helps me focus is to think about a particular person and think about how I can make it better for them or could have made it better for them.
Yeah, and it is often that could have made it better, isn't it? That's really poignant, Jo. There are people that I know that I carry with me too. I don't think I'm quite as focused about how I do that. So that bringing people into mind like that is a very, very special way to be motivated to do the work.
I find it energizing. Like I know the way I'm saying it might sound like heavy, and of course there's a heaviness when some of those people are not around anymore. Yeah. There is a heaviness, but I think there's also sometimes I actually just find it really it's sort of propelling. And it doesn't always feel heavy. And sometimes I think about the people in a way that has a lightness. Like I think about them, if I knew them personally, maybe funny, quirky things about them. Yeah. So it's not necessarily as heavy as it sounds.
No, I understand that. I do. And I think that it's one of the things, I was having a conversation with someone the other day about the balancing light and shade. So yes, there's a heaviness to it, but there's a lightness that we need to bring, and you got to get the balance of those things right. I want to talk about when you started in this role and what one of the things that you brought to when you started. So on your first day in office as Commissioner, one of the things you spoke about was the importance of exactly what you're talking about, turning a 10-year Pride in Our Future strategy from pages into real action. So you're coming up to 2 years in the role now. Talk to us about the role and what your approach is and what the work of the Victorian Commissioner for LGBTIQA+ communities. What is it you do, Jo?
Yeah, I think what's interesting about my role is it's not statutory. And so I'm not a complaints commissioner, like, say, other commissioners like disability, other human rights commissioners sort of are driven by community or have a function that has community complaints within it. My role is very much about advocacy and being a conduit between the community and government. And it's advocacy. You know, my role is to be an advocate, and I need to be informed by I need to be informed by the community in order to do that advocacy. And I take that, like, sometimes that's hearing people, like being in a consultation with organisations. Sometimes it's meeting with like victim survivor advocates, and other times it's actually just reading evidence. You know, like reading research papers, reading reports. And I think you need to bring all those things together. And that's what I bring to bear on, like, how I decode and make real what the strategy is trying to get at. I think also what's difficult, like, the strategy is always there in the background, and I'm a champion of the 10-year strategy. It also belongs to the whole of government. So it is not only for me to do, but I sort of think about it as that I champion it and push it back on track at different moments and with different people. But when you're thinking about whole of government, it's everyone from, like, the suburban rail link, like, think about all of government, to health, to funding child protection. You know, it's every part of government. So that's really hard. So I'm a champion of it, but it's not my sole responsibility. And I sort of have this metrics where I think about, you know, 40% of my job is planned and 60% of it is responsive. And that's like, it's not as mathematical as that. That's more something, but it's something like there's things that just come at you, right? Like, that you don't necessarily, that fall into the big brackets of the plan. Yeah. But they're not something that people knew about when it was happening. No. You know, like, for example, like knowing that as soon as I came into the role, I'd actually be responding to a really big spike in gay and bisexual men being bashed. Yeah. You know, that wasn't written into the plan, when it was written a few years ago, because that hadn't happened yet. But absolutely that falls within the bracket of safe. You know, we want safe lives. We want police to, I'm there to work with the Victorian police for victim survivors. And it's all in there. But that's the responsive element, is that the world around me has to be responded to as well. It can't be as rigid as this is the plan and I sort of systematically roll it out. You know, and I think most CEOs and most people who run organisations can relate to that.
Yeah, absolutely. That need to be, and I think what you've talked about really deeply listening to what's happening in communities, and how do you synthesise then what you're knowing and learning, but having a radar for where there are emerging issues and where things are shifting is that's something that takes a lot of my energy too, is really listening for those, particularly I think listening for what are the early warning, how are we going to get ahead of when things are harming the people that we are here to serve. Can you, that issue that you've raised about that emergence of the issue, and one of the aspects of that was the use of, and again, this is something that has been an emerging issue for all of us, about the online world and how that's impacting. And this one, there was a real issue around dating apps and the way they were being weaponised and to facilitate hate crimes against LGBTIQA+ people. And I know the Victorian Police did arrest some people over time. You have played a really key voice in that. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. People have been arrested in Victoria for tech-facilitated abuse. That's a really sizable number, but we know the actual occurrences of this abuse will be far higher. And I talk about it as being tech-facilitated abuse, but to be really specific about what it is, it's about gay and bisexual men being hunted through dating apps. Now, we know that this is something that's happened in the family violence space, in the sexual assault space for women and girls for a long time. And we've also seen signs of this happening in gay and bisexual men as well in other demographics. However, there was something that really changed in 2024. There was an organised component to it, where it went from something that was happening more sporadically to something that was like an organised process that included like filming people and an element of extortion. And there was a rhythm to it of how people were doing the crime. And that was picked up by the priority populations police, prior population's role in the Victoria Police, they started seeing this kind of rhythm.
Yeah.
And they started seeing how it was happening, the kind of locations it was happening, what was being said to the victims, and how they were being tracked. So they were originally being largely found on the Grindr app, and then being lured into public places to have sex. And then when they went there, and sometimes in their, I should say, not just public places, sometimes in their own home.
Yeah.
And then when the meetup happened, there would be a group of young men who would bash them. So they're pretty horrible crimes.
Yeah, it's
yeah.
Joe.
Now, in Victoria, look, they've happened in every state and territory. They've also happened overseas. In Victoria, we've had a higher arrest rate, and I think that's not because I think it's happening more here. I have to attribute that to the close work that my office, Thorn Harbour Health, and the priority populations part of Victoria Police have done to work to really target and focus this issue. And we're starting to see the same thing happen in New South Wales, where they're starting to target and focus this issue, and the rest are starting to roll in. And I think where governments put energy into finding these cases, they're popping up, and arrests are happening, and also victim survivors are starting to come forward. So it's not a Victoria issue. I want to be really clear about it. It's a national issue, and we do need every state and territory to be focusing on this. And I think in time, some kind of a national roundtable would be excellent as well.
Let's talk about that, Joe. I think what you're describing too, because I would fully support from what I know that this is not something that is about Victoria in particular, but where people are seeing and paying attention and responding appropriately with care and paying, and taking things seriously, it makes a big difference. So tell me a bit about what your experience, because what you've described in terms of the relationship, and it's not always been a good relationship with police, right? So the policing relationship, their response to this level of harm that's occurring towards the LGBTQI+ community is important, the way they responded to that. And that I understand there was a particular police officer involved in that as well.
I was just trying to think about, I want to give his name because he's amazing, Jeremy Oliver, and he has done incredible work as the manager in priority populations. I think the fact that there's actually something in Victoria Police called priority populations, there's a role there, and he works in priority populations, but he's specifically, the priority population he represents is ours, the LGBTIQA+, and he's been working in this for quite some time. And yeah, they've built those relationships, they've built them with the community. And I think a big turning point for us in Victoria is we had a community forum, and I contacted the then CEO of Thorn Harbour Health, and I said, I think we've got to have a community forum where we just actually have a conversation with the community. We say to people, we're going to come and meet us here, and we're going to talk about these tech facilitated abuse. And we held it at the Laird, which is a gay men's bar in Collingwood. And we had this meeting, and we didn't really know what this was going to be like. But the community showed up, and there was numerous people in the room. We had a panel. It was me and Jeremy and someone from Thorn Harbour, and a number of Victorian politicians came, as MPs came as well, to hear what people had to say. The place was packed out, and numerous people in the room came forward and said, look, this has happened to me, but I didn't go to police. And they just, and why they weren't going to the police, they felt deeply ashamed. They felt like they had done something, like they'd done something wrong. They'd wanted to have sex with a stranger, and they'd taken on this shaming guilt, and they thought, some people had come forward, but these people in the room were people, and they were people of all different ages. I can't typecast the person. There was multiple, different ages, different backgrounds, different ethnicities of people that were telling us, I haven't come forward, and they were happening in the inner city, places that we would consider to be safe spaces for our community. And one of the things that I'd learnt from my work of working in family violence is I just really immediately identified this as something that women and girls have had to really work and overcome, the shame and stigma of when violence is perpetrated against you. Of that you were wearing the wrong thing, you were in the wrong place. And I thought, wow, we've really got to bring this to the LGBTI space, particularly the men's space, the gay and bisexual men's space. I remember saying in this room to people, I was like, you have nothing to be ashamed of. I understand that you feel ashamed, but this is a stigma. And seeing the tears in people's eyes, people needed to hear that. And I think that's when you get a joined up approach, you bring that feminist lens to it has an application beyond just women and girls, and it was certainly useful that day.
What an incredibly powerful thing to have created a safe space for your community in that way and those people. It's quite moving, Joe, to hear you talk about what that must have been like for those people to feel safe enough to turn up. And then I'm sure lots of them thought, I'm going to go, but I'm not necessarily going to say anything, because you're right, shame is such we don't understand enough about how much it drives both behaviour, but also stops people being able to reach out to get some support. We need to be able to talk more about shame. Helping people to move past that shame is really powerful, and it's a gift that I've seen the way you can create that safety in a space. So it's really moving to hear you talk about it, and absolutely we need to talk about how I think the other point that you've just made about learning from how the power of bringing people together and naming an issue to, like, where you started this was talking about how that's what drove the change, right? That's what you saw as the beginning. Yeah.
100%, because we just started to see, one, that there was these people that were prepared to talk to their peers about it, right? But they weren't yet ready to go to the police. But a couple of those people did go to the police afterwards, because we had Jeremy in the room and they had that interconnection, and like, there is this incredible history in the queer men's space about speaking out against silence, because that's what they had to do with AIDS.
Yeah.
And again, it was a stigma. And I remember, so we did a second community forum, again, as a follow-up later on to tell people about the parliamentary inquiry. And I remember sitting in the room and I was, again, talking about the parliamentary inquiry, talking about shame and stigma, and I had right in front of me these two people who were long-term, one of them was Jamie Gardner, who has played this incredible role. He was there to support others. He hadn't been a victim of a hate crime, but he was there to support others. And I was looking at this, I was like, this man right here, he's the reason why, we have decriminalisation in Victoria, and we have the state apology. And I was looking at him and looking at the man that was sitting next to him, which was a board member of Thorn Harbour. And I looked at these two men and I just thought, wow. And I remember just saying it out loud from my heart. I was like, I don't even know what it must feel like for you two to see this happening all over again. Yeah. And afterwards they said, thank you so much for saying that. Because I think there's a real pain for that older generation who it may not be happening to them, but they were like, wow, we thought we'd buried that issue, and here we are. So, I think that's something we've got to acknowledge about what's happening here, is that there's also we thought we had gotten through this, but here it is again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a lot of us thinking about that too, in terms of hard fought for gains, that battles that we thought we'd been part of, wins that we'd made, that we're seeing now backlash against, and some really, in some ways, some things even worse than, some of the stuff in terms of what's happening around attitudes and the harm that's being caused in some ways is feeling very hard to watch. So I agree, we need to acknowledge the wins and the gains, but we need to, and what we can learn from, because I think also what you're talking about, there's a great deal to learn from those campaigns and those, what's happened. I think there's a great deal to learn from a lot of the work, the advocacy and campaigning work that the LGBTIQA+ community has done, with AIDS and other things that you've talked about more broadly. And it's one of the things that, you and I have talked about recently, about the conversation that's happening now about how do we engage men and boys in this work? I have to acknowledge it's not new. This has happened for many years, but it's happening now. There is some momentum around engaging men and boys, involving them in solutions to end violence. And from my particular perspective, to end domestic, family and sexual violence, but more broadly, if to do that, you need to end violence in our communities in all of its forms. So you've talked a lot lately about alternative, positive versions of masculinity that society must shift much more actively towards. Can you talk about your work and what you're thinking and what you think needs to be done in that space?
I'm still working it out as everyone else is, and it's a lifelong project. And I think some of that is actually the work, right? Is encouraging men and boys to do self-exploration.
Yes.
I think that's pretty key.
That's right. None of us
Yeah, I
have it
think
all worked out. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think some of the attitudes around being a man is that you're supposed to have had it all worked out.
Yes.
That sort of becomes it's hard to decouple that from masculinity, and that sort of help seeking is in itself an emasculating thing. And so I think we have to turn those things on their head. And for me, like talking about masculinity, like I'm somebody who chose to be a man. I wasn't born a man. I'm a trans man. I've paid a lot of attention to men, and I made an active choice as someone who grew up facing some, the negativity that a lot of women and girls face. I was a young girl that carried their keys between their knuckles, and had deodorant in their bag that they could impulse deodorant to spray in someone's face, and these are if they attacked you. And these were things that we shared from girl to girl about like how you protect yourself. And I certainly had friends who had been raped and had been sexually assaulted, and like it was something close. And it felt really fear. So, like for me to have lived a life of feeling in my own body afraid of boys, afraid of men's violence, and then to make a choice to become a man, it takes a bit of like thinking through what all that is, and understanding that like actually the conclusion I came to is that I'm a masculine man, and that masculinity, it is not inherently something that has to be oppressive. And actually, it's not a binary of like, well, a non-oppressive man is an effeminate man. No, actually, it can be both ways. An effeminate man can be oppressive, and he can also not be, and vice versa about masculinity. Yeah. And the way that I really learnt that about how masculinity can be many different things is I learnt it from butch lesbians. Yep. Like I learnt it from them, of women who took on masculinity, and they embodied masculinity. And I saw that how different bodies could interpret masculineness. And so that was a pathway for me of seeing those women who paved a way of masculinity on a body that was not born male. For me, I didn't want to stop there. I wanted to become a trans man, and I wanted to, have the binary experience of being the way I am now. And what I bring forward to this, or what I want people to hear, is that I really like masculinity. So I'm someone who comes at this not somebody who wants to get rid of it or somebody that doesn't like it, because I've worked so hard to become it. So I'm really invested in this project. I'm really impressed in this project of like how you can be a different type of man, and I've had to find my own way through that. And so I think these are some of the conversations, and like I've gone looking for male role models in deliberate ways and sometimes unconscious ways. And I think that I've got some, I've offered some reflections about this, and I think I've got some things to say about it. But one of the things I think doesn't help is to say that like masculinity is not the problem. Power over people, oppression, control, coercion, these are a problem. They can be decoupled from masculinity, and like that's the project. Yeah, that is the project, and it's a big, hard project that's going to require lots of us. I was in my early 20s when I had my first child, and it was a boy, and I was a pretty strident young feminist at the time, and it was pretty confronting, I have to say, to have a boy, because I was kind of pretty straightforward about what my views, I think, were about most of the patriarchy and men, and it was very confronted. And so I think that thing about, having to think about masculinity, I haven't gone the same. Obviously, I suppose one of my reflections listening to you is that we have very individual and specific pathways, and trying to paint everybody with the same brush about what masculinity is or isn't, or what your pathway is. It's really important to share the diversity of experiences like you have had. And I've previously heard you share a powerful moment around the birth of your daughter. You happy to share a bit about that? Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, my partner gave birth to our daughter, and in the Royal Women's Hospital in Melbourne, which was a fantastic experience, actually. I mean, I'll get more into that in a moment. But my partner had a traumatic birth, and so people who've given birth, they know what I mean when I say that. So, but what I think was a tremendous experience for me actually was a lot of work has happened at the Royal Women's Hospital to make it an accepting place. My partner was in labour for like 16 hours. It was like terribly long labour. And during that time, we saw so many people. Shifts changed. Anaesthetists came in, different doctors came in, a lot of different things happened, and including eventually in NICU and etc. And but like one thing that happened for me was that I remember that I kept seeing on everyone's, I sort of clocked it, everyone sort of had like a little rainbow sticker or some kind of, a lot of them had a lot of rainbow somewhere on their uniform.
Yeah.
Just something really small.
Yeah.
And you sort of clock it and, and to all intents and purposes, how my partner and I present in the world, people would just think we're a pretty ordinary heterosexual couple. And they wouldn't really think of us as a rainbow family by appearance. And there's nothing, it doesn't need to be documented anywhere. But what I noted is that they were doing this regardless of who they were seeing, right? They had these little stickers on in their rainbow lanyards. And over this long period of time, I realised that this is going to be a safe place to be who I am. And there was this moment where after my daughter was born and you want to do the skin-to-skin contact, and because I knew that people to some level had some training in LGBTIQA+, it was going to be okay for me to unbutton shirt and show my very visible top surgery scars on my chest and hold my baby to my chest. And like that was an incredible moment in our life. And I don't know if I hadn't seen all those stickers over that period of time, whether I would have felt as comfortable or maybe whether I would have actually done that thing, which was actually just so incredible, for me, like so important for me to be able to do skin to skin contact. And so like, look, that's an example why inclusion matters, right? Like, and that you can't always see the person in the room who needs you to do the thing. No. Which is like have a little tiny, I mean, these stickers were really little, but for me, they just shone out from their badges.
Yeah, it does, because those moments mean so much, Joe. I'm so glad you were able to have that, because you can never take that away. But being able to, again, that's a bit of a theme, right, about the capacity to create safe spaces and for people to be seen.
So then my baby, shortly after she was born, Rosa, she was rushed off to NICU and I went with her, which is, if anyone's had the experience, they know that the parents get divided. And my partner needed to have a range of things happen because of her traumatic birth, and I went with my child, Rosa, and went up to NICU and spent the hours and hours holding her hand. But one of the things that happened to me during this time before my partner came up is I went to this room that was like the break room for parents. And I went into this room and there was lots of books in there and it's just a place you can chill out. And I just broke down and hysterically cried. Because, to be clear, I thought that my partner and my baby were going to die at a certain point. And I'd held it all together. And when I realised that they weren't going to die, I went into this room and really sobbed my heart out. But then this man came forward and he just said, "Oh, you're having a really hard time, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah, I am. And I was just crying. And he was just that crying that you just can't help, it's just so guttural. Yeah. And he just sat with me and he talked to me and he just said, "Tell me what happened." And we had this most amazing conversation. And he just sat with me while I cried and went through it with me and showed up with me, this absolute stranger. He was not a worker at the hospital. He was another dad who had a child in NICU, but he just was so present with me. And it is the most incredible experience I've had with another man in my whole entire life, about how he could sit with me in a moment of grief and hold me and just in such uncomfortability. And what I want to say is I think that was not weakness. That was extreme strength. Yeah. And that was a beautiful, strong, courageous masculinity. To sit with someone like that, that is the kind of brave, positive masculinity that is not easy. It is hard masculinity. No. And he did it. And I want more men to be I want to be more like him, and he's a role model. Yeah.
Yeah. That's such a powerful story and experience, Joe. And I think that description of strength and grace, I mean, most of us have had some experience of nothing quite like that about needing to sit with. To be able to sit alongside someone takes enormous courage.
Totally. And he wasn't trying to say like, you should do this, bro, you should do that, bro.
Yeah.
He was literally just like, tell me more about that. And he just said, and I remember him just saying things like, that sounds really hard. And at some point I turned the conversation back and I said, like, tell me about your experience. And lo and behold, he's a social worker. But he wasn't on shift. He was absolutely not on shift.
No.
You know, he was there with his child who had Down syndrome and was from Tasmania. I found out that I didn't really know that a lot of Down syndrome kids from Tasmania end up getting supported through the Royal Women's Hospital in Melbourne. And so he was there and he was on a really long journey. Like his child was having heart surgery. You know, and he was not in an easy place. So this is what I mean about the courage of his masculinity.
Yeah.
He was not in an easy place himself, and he put himself there with me and asked really nothing of me. And I just thought, wow, how do we teach men and boys to do this? You know, like, and that's what I think about him. Which is when I started talking about bringing people into the room, I bring him with me, like, you know, and how do we teach men and boys to feel like that's a heroic moment? A heroic moment isn't when you hold all your feelings in and go and punch a wall, right? That's not that might be a response that you have that you feel is uncontrollable. But, you know, the hero's journey, like, is a man who can do what that man did or something similar, you know. And I want to make that normal, you know. Like, I want my daughter to have men like him around, you know. Like I want men like that around. I think other men want other men like that around. Like, I think this is something that if we could make more normal, it would be great for all of us.
It certainly would. It certainly would make a huge difference, wouldn't it? I mean, in all of those moments. And look, I think that's where if I can draw this back then to in May, we've had both International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, Intersexual Discrimination and Transphobia, Ida Hobbit Day, as well as LGBTQ, DV, Domestic Violence Awareness Day. So and those are moments to do exactly that, right? To show up and pay attention and learning what it is that you might need to do to create the safety like you have created this safety. That's what these awareness days are about thinking about that. And we know, so La Trobe University's National Private Lives 3 survey was run in 2019, and that focused on health and wellbeing of LGBTIQA+ people. And we know that from those surveys and other surveys that there's very high proportion of respondents. So 49% in that survey said that they had experienced sexual assault. 60% had ever had any experiences of violence, had experiences of violence from an intimate partner, which is well above the population average. So we know that this is a community in which violence does occur, and we need to be more aware of and create spaces to talk about that. Can you talk a bit about what's unique about domestic, family and sexual violence issues? What are the unique issues emerging in the community that you think are the most important to be highlighting?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, in the case of, I mean, predominantly, I think it still is when it's physical violence, it's still men's violence. So it's men's violence against men, men's violence against their bisexual female partner, or maybe a bisexual man against a female partner. There's still a lot of men's violence. And I think that's worth saying as well. And sometimes in who's the perpetrator in the family violence can often be, you know, the father as well against the LGBTIQA+ young person. So I think there's still a lot of men's violence, and that's worth saying. But I also think that there is recognising that there's also intimate partner violence that comes from other genders and from woman to woman and other non-binary, and, you know, it's not just men's violence. So I think people need to understand, like, the complexity of it, and often that I think people understand that, like, when the police come to the house, sometimes the blunt instrument of the training in the family violence sector doesn't help the police understand, or the first responders understand, what they need to do. For example, you know, like, if you think you're attending a domestic violence situation and you turn up and it's 2 men, that doesn't make it any less safe. It does, and sometimes it can be like, oh, well, it's two men, they can sort of fend for themselves, if you like. But also, like, you got to remember there's two men. Don't forget to ask if there's children.
Yeah.
Don't assume there isn't children. Don't assume that the two women you're turning up to are flatmates or friends. I think that there's challenges with the first responders that, and so that people don't necessarily get seen. Victim survivors don't get seen, and they can often be seen as that. There can be biases that they're a bias that comes ahead of the risk assessment. I think everyone deserves to have a thorough risk assessment done about whether their life is at risk and whether they need refuge and what kind of support services they need and referrals they need. Because sometimes a bias can come that the LGBTI people are less at risk, and that can be the bias in someone's mind when they show up. Oh, two women, it's probably not going to be life-threatening. Men's violence against men, it's probably not going to be life-threatening. And I do hear services say, for example, that they think. They've just outright said to me that they think they've got to prioritise women and girls. And when I say a lot of the time, kids aren't even in the frame, right? Like sometimes it's just like they need to prioritise women. And I understand that, except for that we should come at this work with like an open mind to risk. Otherwise, and sometimes it might be like, and then overwhelmingly still the cases are just numerically going to be, a heterosexual cisgender couple, male violence against women. They're going to be because numerically what's out there in the world. But we've got to try and see the victim survivor, whoever they are, whether they're LGBTIQA+, whether they're Aboriginal, whether they're migrant background. We've got to see them as the person that they are and try and park those assumptions. Because otherwise, if we don't see people in those situations and we rely on assumptions, those assumptions can be life-threatening.
Absolutely. So and that I think that's a really key point, Joe. The impact of biases, so that when people don't see the risk that's really there, and what we need to do about that. Joe, one of the reasons I started doing this podcast was really about getting pointy about being hopeful that we can achieve this, right? That we have seen, you've already kind of alluded to, other campaigns where, we have turned things around in a way that community didn't believe was going to be possible. So, and I worry a bit that we don't believe that we can end domestic, family and sexual violence. And when I say end, one of the things that I've been borrowing from the homelessness sector is to describe ending domestic, family and sexual violence is for us to get to the point where it is rare, brief and non-recurrent. Those things are measurable and they're achievable. And we need to believe that that's possible to get there. So what is it that gives you hope? Where are you seeing things that give you hope that we can end violence?
I think where there are instances, I believe that, there's no crystal balls, we can't see the future, but we can look to history and it's the best predictor of the future. And it tells us that things can change and that things can be cyclic as well. I mean, recently, I was actually I was reminded of how things can be changed when we change the social conditions around people. Like infanticide used to be a lot higher. Right. And women would go to prison for infanticide because they would kill their child out of wedlock because they knew the child would be removed or they wouldn't be able to look after the child. I was reminded of this because I went to Old Dubbo Jail in New South Wales and looking at the female prisoners who were held in that jail, a lot of them were there for infanticide.
Oh, wow.
And I was like looking at this and I was thinking, we have changed that. Yeah. Like where the way we treat single mothers, the supports we give them with the welfare, the fact there's been these whole advocacy groups for single mothers. We don't send people off to convents. We don't remove their children. Not in all instances. I mean, I know that's a complicated thing to say in a certain space because there is still child removal. But I think it's not what it was. And so that's a really grim story I've told, but what it tells you is it's something very grim. Something that seemed just like part of the fabric of society, that unwed mothers, it was if you became pregnant out of wedlock, it was pretty dark. You think there was no future. That you are going to be sort of persecuted yourself, or you're going to have to do terrible things to get by. And we've turned that around by changing the social conditions around people. And so I think if we can do something like that seemed impossible. or just part of the fabric of society, we can do it again around this. We can create a world where we change the social fabric, change the relationships between people, and see it as an absolute anomaly that is not the sheer numbers that we see that women are being killed and every week in Australia. Like, I do believe it. And so history always points to me. I always go there and look for that change. I also think that I all the time, one of the most inspiring things I ever hear men say is, I'm stopping the violence in my time.
Yeah.
I love to hear that. Like when Connor Powell's a good champion for this, and he gets up and he says, as a survivor himself, he gets up and saying, violence stops with me. And I mean, talking about male heroes, like what a heroic thing to do. I'm making the violence stop with me, even though I have every reason to, these people have every reason to have unresolved issues that can play out. The bravery and their courage is to say, no, it stops here. Yeah. It stops in my generation and I'm not passing it on. And so they're the two things in this space that I think really get me through.
That's incredibly powerful, and what a lovely note to finish on, Joe. I think the hope is in the history of where we have made really dramatic transformations through things that were absolutely achievable, and that there are things that we could make choices today that would change. The things that we now completely take for granted is a really good reminder, and the heroes that are around us right now who are already stepping up and doing this work. And Joe, I think you're one of those. I've seen you step into rooms and speak like that, and we are very lucky to have you in this role, and I really look forward to more conversations.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, and of course we do this together. I just see that you and me, Micaela, we're in this together. Yes. We really are. And thank you for all you're doing. We can't do it without each other.
No, completely agree. We're all it's a joint project. None of us do this alone. Thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast, Joe.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Voices Towards 2050, Ending Gender-Based Violence. Subscribe and join us for future conversations as we work together to achieve a future free from domestic, family and sexual violence. To learn more about the Commission, visit our website at dfsbc.gov.au. If you need support, contact 1-800-RESPECT or call 1-800-737-732. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, you can call 13-YARN or 139276. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the guests and do not necessarily represent the views of the Australian Government or the Commission.